I'd like to talk to you about prioritizing the Common Core state standards. You know, in the past we've talked about the need to really provide a very sharp focus on what students need to know and be able to do. And it was very interesting because in 2008, Sir Michael Barber, who was the former advisor to Prime Minister Tony Blair in the UK, made this quote that I've been using quite a lot in my presentations about the need to power or prioritize the Common Core. And as you can see, it says the question of national standards is inescapable. The U.S. needs fewer, clearer, and higher national standards. So my question, obviously, even though these words are fairly self-explanatory, is when we think of clearer, what do we mean? Understandable. Higher, most people would say rigorous. But the key focus for this in terms of prioritizing the Common Core is the word fewer. And what that obviously means, or should mean to all of us, is we would hope that there would actually be less so teachers could have a better chance of going deep and focusing on a subset of the total number of standards so that students could really demonstrate that they had attained those. So the question then was about, are there indeed fewer? And I thought when the Common Core came out in June of 2010, I thought, well, it's going to be interesting to find out whether we still need to prioritize the Common Core as we have for years found the need to power or prioritize the state standards. So I thought there's only one way to find out. I better count them, and that's exactly what I did. Now, before I show you these numbers, I want to explain to you that I'm not talking about the 32 anchor standards, for example, in English language arts, those broad statements that apply kindergarten through 12th grade. I'm talking about the grade-specific outcomes, the standards that the kindergarten children need to learn, that the 7th graders need to learn. Those are the numbers that I prioritized. So we're going to begin by looking at language arts first. And in the English language arts Common Core, kindergarten through 5th grade, the way I organize these numbers is, as you see on screen right now, by grade level, and then also along the top we see the different strands of the way the Common Core standards have been organized. The strands are named literature, informational text, foundational skills, writing, speaking, listening, and then of course language. And individually or by strand, they don't look like they're that many, but when you look to the far right of the screen, you'll notice that we've added up, we're into the 70s, 80s, and even 91 in grade 3. Now, what's interesting about that is those numbers, a lot of people have said that they're initially disappointed that those numbers aren't lower because these are typical of the numbers that we saw for years with state standards. The idea then is that these standards are needed to be learned by the end of the year. This Common Core state standards are built upon what we call a mastery of learning model, which means that students are expected to demonstrate proficiency in each level's standards before they proceed to the next grade level in order to be ready for the next grade level. So we've got a pretty good undertaking already for kindergarten through 5th grade. Now when I show you the next slide, it's going to show the secondary, 6 through 8, which are in individual grade bands, and then also 9 through 12, which are organized 9, 10, and 11, and 12. But your eye is probably automatically going to the right side of the screen because, as you see, the numbers really haven't changed, even though what's interesting, if you'll notice, foundational skills, those are gone by the time that we get to secondary, and yet the numbers remain the same. So the expectation is that the students would have acquired those foundational skills so that by the time they enter 6th grade, the English teachers in 6th grade, the writing teachers in 6th grade, and so on can build on that foundation. And yet the numbers, as you see, are still quite high. What's the addition? Where is the new focus and thrust of the standards for secondary? You'll see that they're in the writing column. And the writing standards for the Common Core are rigorous. They're quite lengthy. Many of them are numbered with a 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, D, F. I counted all of those individual statements to come up with those totals because they did represent the knowledge and skills that students would need to know and be able to do. So we can see that the challenge so far with English language arts, the question usually at this point that I ask audiences, do you still think there is a need to prioritize or power the Common Core? And then the answer based on these numbers is yes, we do. One of the key things I do want to mention, however, is the fact that the Common Core state standards were built on a learning progressions model. they are deliberately spiraled from grade to grade to grade. And one of the messages, or sometimes the questions I get from audiences is, won't you be interrupting or breaking those learning progressions if we identify certain ones as being more important than others? And the answer is absolutely not. We're going to maintain the integrity of the document, but we're just simply looking at the sheer numbers of standards with this increase of rigor, which they all represent, and asking if it's really possible for our educators to really fully teach and assess students and send those students forward to the next level of learning. What about those teachers in science and social studies? What is going to be their role in all of this? One of the messages of the Common Core Initiative is that literacy is a shared responsibility across all the disciplines. For history social studies, in grades 6, 8, and then 9, 10, and 11, 12, there is an expectation that history social studies teachers would also be dealing with implementing 10 reading standards, and also science and technology, also 10 reading standards. And then both of those areas, history social studies and science and technology, will also be addressing 20 interdisciplinary writing standards. So even though those numbers don't add up for those teachers, because obviously history social studies teachers are separate from science and technology teachers at secondary, students will really be also taking on an additional 40 standards that they will be receiving through the disciplines of science, social studies, history, technology, and so on. So what's happening is that secondary teachers of these subject areas are getting together to prioritize these literacy standards, and then they're going to be using those priorities in units of study in their content areas. And it's funny because initially a lot of people look and they see the asterisk, where I'll bring their attention to the asterisk, which reads, not intended to replace the existing content standards in those areas, but rather to supplement them. So what does that mean? That means in addition to all of their content standards in their respective subjects, teachers of these subject areas are also now being asked to incorporate or infuse literacy standards into their content areas. Again, why the need to prioritize is because of the volume of standards that we're asking our teachers to work with. It's interesting because when we get to mathematics, the other major area of the Common Core, this quotation really talks about the fact that you can't just go by the numbers of standards. The math standards are full of an increase in rigor that we've never seen before in the United States. The Thomas Fordham Institute in Washington, D.C., when they were actually comparing the standards of the Common Core with the standards in states, found that 34 states had standards that were actually inferior in terms of rigor to the Common Core for English language arts, and 37 states had standards that were inferior to rigor to state standards in mathematics. So the idea to keep in mind here is we've got to look at the increase in rigor, even though as I show you these numbers, you're going to first think, wow, that's great. Math has fewer standards, as you're going to see here. So for kindergarten through 5th grade, rather than strands, as we call the organizing categories in English language arts, in mathematics they're referred to as domains. And for kindergarten through 5th grade, we have counting and cardinality, operations in algebra, number operations in base 10, number operations in fractions, measurement, data, and geometry. So if you look across the columns and you see kindergarten, 25 standards. 5th grade, 40 standards. These, to a classroom teacher, of which I was one for many, many years, these look doable. But then we have to look more closely. One of the standards for illustration was in 5th grade in number of operations and fractions. As it says at the bottom of the screen in the middle, the red one says 14 standards. Let's take one example from the 5th grade standards. There aren't that many overall, but if you look at the wording of this, interpret multiplication as scaling or resizing by, and I'm going to read this for effect, explaining why multiplying a given number by a fraction greater than 1 results in a product greater than the given number, recognizing multiplication by whole numbers greater than 1 as a familiar case, explaining why multiplying a given number by a fraction less than 1 results in a product smaller than the given number, and relating the principle of fraction equivalence, then there's the formula, to the effect of multiplying A over B by 1. Now, I'm a former elementary teacher. I had to read this a few times to really even understand what this was about, which is also one of the reasons why another practice that people are talking about as being very necessary in tandem with powering or prioritizing the standards is unwrapping the standards. How do we know really what students need to know and be able to do? Well, that deconstruction of that standard takes place at another time, but initially we're still trying to read and get some understanding. What does this mean? So even though there's only one central mathematical idea here, most educators look at this and they're a little bit overwhelmed by the volume and the thickness and the density of the statement itself. Again, another reason why we're not prioritizing simply by numbers of standards, but also by their rigor. When we get to the secondary level, all the domain names change. They're now going to be called ratio and proportion, number systems, expressions and equations, geometry, statistics, probability, and functions. Now, there are through lines that connect the elementary standards in mathematics with the secondary standards in mathematics, but just for right now, let's go back to our focus which is the numbers of these standards. Now, you can see that they're climbing, 47 in grade 6, 43 in grade 7, 36 in grade 8, and with the complexity and the rigor of these standards, as was seen in that earlier slide example for grade 5, again, I think most people will agree that there is a need to talk and look at the prioritization of these standards. In mathematics in particular, though, I do want to make one very important point, is that the expectation is students will have these standards, and I use this term in quotes, mastered by the end of each grade level, so they are ready to enter the next grade level and build upon that foundation. So this puts a tremendous amount of pressure and responsibility on teachers and on kids to make sure that they've really learned these standards. Again, the reason for prioritizing, not to break the learning progressions, but to make sure that students are moving forward with those assured competencies of the grade before. In high school, it's a little bit different situation because what's happened at the high school, the way they've organized the standards, are they're organized according to conceptual categories. You see the numbers of these standards that are underneath these headings of conceptual categories, but what needs to take place now is to take all of these related standards for each of these categories and place them into math courses at the high school level. Appendix A that was provided with the Common Core Mathematics documents is an absolutely indispensable document for seeing two pathways, whether we wish to follow a more traditional pathway, such as true in most U.S. high school math classrooms of Algebra 1, followed by Geometry, followed by Algebra 2, and so on. These conceptual categories have already been placed into those respective courses in Appendix A. The other option, the other pathway, of course, is the integrated model, which is the one that's used in many nations throughout the world. But this Appendix A document is going to be very necessary when educators get together to understand the Common Core high school math standards, and also when they look at prioritizing, they can already see those standards nestled in those courses of either the traditional approach or the integrated approach, and then prioritize from there. One additional thing that the adopting states of the Common Core were allowed to do was to add in an additional 15% of their existing state standards into the Common Core in case they felt that there was something missing from the Common Core that they wanted to retain from the original documents of the states. But then the cumulative effect of this is what? There will now, those states that do exercise that option, we're going to be expanding the number, the complexity of the Common Core standards themselves. Another reason to consider as a professional learning community, prioritizing these Common Core standards to provide the focus that teachers need to help students achieve the purpose of these Common Cores. My questions I often ask educators as we're considering about this idea of prioritizing is, are all of these Common Core standards in the 3 grade spans of elementary, middle, and high, are all of them essential? That means absolutely critical for students to acquire in order to be ready for the next level of learning, the next grade level, the next course. So that's one thing to consider. Are all of these standards equal? And the second one is, the reality is the school year long enough to afford teachers the time to adequately, notice the emphasis on adequately, teach, assess, and then go back and reteach and reassess the students on all of these Common Core standards. So they're ready, the students ready, to proceed to the next level of learning. Again, I think it's a strong argument for the need to consider prioritizing the Common Core. I want to wrap up by giving a definition of power standards or priority standards, and it's this: a carefully selected subset of the total list of the grade-specific, the course-specific standards within each content area. That means within ELA, English Language Arts, and with mathematics, that students must know and be able to do by the end of the school year, so that they are prepared to enter the next grade or the next course. Then people want to know, well, what about the other standards? What about all the standards that are not identified as priority? Because educators are responsible for teaching all of the Common Core state standards, and we certainly want them to, all we're talking about is distinguishing those that are truly meeting these criteria of being essential. Then what about the other standards? What do we call them? How do we deal with them? How do we address those? I've named those other standards supporting standards, and here's a definition of those. The supporting standards are those standards that support, connect to, or enhance the priority standards. And they're taught within the context of the priorities, but they do not receive the same degree of instruction and assessment emphasis as do the priority standards. So now usually what people say at this point, well, they want to know, well, how do we prioritize them? You've talked about criteria. How do we actually go into this process of taking the Common Core standards in English Language Arts and mathematics, assembling our teams together, and determining that subset of the total? Well, there are criteria that we present for both English Language Arts and also for mathematics, the lens through which they look to prioritize. But in essence, in a nutshell, here are the steps that educators will then go through. They'll make their initial selections using the criteria that they're presented at the time of the seminar or the workshop. Then they'll also look for connections to state tests. Now, it's interesting because people are now saying, well, we know that the state test will be going toward the Smarter Balance Assessment or the PARC assessment in 2014-15. We don't have those tests in front of us yet. How do we use that criteria to help us prioritize? What we're saying now is, let's look at historically what we need to know in terms of kids' achievements on state tests, and then also stay abreast of what is being advertised as the areas of focus through the PARC and Smarter Balance Assessment Consortia. So we have that information in front of us, and then what we do is we'll make our initial selections, reach consensus, and then chart those selections by each grade level. So there'll be the chart for kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and so on. These charts are then placed on the wall, and we have a discussion, which is the most powerful part of this entire process. Educators present will then discuss the vertical alignment, kindergarten through 12th grade. If kids finish and have these standards well in hand by the end of kindergarten, will they be prepared for first grade? If they finish by first grade, will they be prepared for second grade, all the way up through high school, with the goal then is that by the time students leave high school, they will be prepared to achieve the purpose of the Common Core, which is college and career readiness. And then lastly, we talk about not making it an isolated process where only a few people do it, but getting the feedback from colleagues, other administrators, and then combining that feedback into a final published document so that we actually end up with a shared ownership document that has had the input of all. So at this point of the process, people want to know, well, okay, we understand why we need to be doing this. We understand what the priority standards are. We understand what the supporting standards are and how the two go together. But how do you actually select these priorities? Well, obviously we need a set of criteria. The ones we've used for years are still very applicable to prioritizing of the Common Core standards, and they look like this. Readiness for the next level of learning. We've talked a lot about that already. Which standards will really prepare students for the next grade, the next course? The second one, endurance. Which standards represent concepts and skills that are going to last over time? Think of that as life skills, life concepts. The third one is leverage, and this is going to be hugely important with the Common Core because we're talking about literacy across the disciplines, shared responsibility. Which standards, for example, if a student could read a table, chart, and graph in mathematics, Could a student then transfer or leverage that over to read a table, chart, and graph in social studies, visual performing arts, any other content area? So we're looking so far at readiness, endurance, leverage, as lenses, so to speak, through which to find which standards meet these criteria. Those then would be what we call the priorities. The other one that, of course, people want to talk about all the time is what's going to be emphasized on the state test. And now, because we're in transition to the national assessments that are being developed by the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium and also the PARC Assessment Consortium, people are starting to wonder, well, what types of questions are students going to be asked? Where's the emphasis going to be? So this fourth circle addresses external exams. Up to this point, we've always used data from state tests to help inform the selection of priority standards. We're now going to have to be looking more toward the PARC and Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortia for the information they're releasing about the areas of focus and emphasis that students will encounter on the new national exams when they are first administered in 2014-15. So keeping in mind these circles, educators start looking through these circles as they review the standards, study the standards, to start making those selections of which ones should be priorities. In a nutshell, here are those 6 steps. Make the initial selections, decide together in grade span teams which should be those priority standards using the criteria discussed. The second step, again, would be look for those connections to state tests, national assessments. The third one is they'll actually chart their selections after they reach an initial consensus. And then the fourth step, the most powerful one in the process, is the K-12 group will get together and they'll look from grade to grade to grade to make sure that as students leave each grade, if they had those priorities well in hand, would they be prepared for the next level of learning? And then because we want to make this a shared document, a shared ownership of the process and the products that come from that process, we often advocate that educators who are part of the initial selection of these priorities take them back, share with colleagues, acquire their feedback, make some revisions, and then ultimately they will publish those priorities as the subset or the focus point for those standards for the school system. After years of conducting this process with groups all over the United States, I can honestly say that the most powerful step is step 4, the vertical alignment of the standards. Because people can talk up and down the grades about where are these standards? Are we sure that students are going to have them well in hand before they move to the next level of learning? But even after that initial selection of the priority standards is made, if everyone was not involved in a school system, participants want to make sure that they weren't making all the decisions without consulting their colleagues. So the very last step of the process is we ask them to share those documents, those initial selections with their colleagues, get their feedback, make some changes if necessary, and then when it's published, we have truly a shared ownership document that can be used throughout the school system. To wrap up this overview of how to prioritize the Common Core state standards, I'd like to show you this important message that I have found over the years is absolutely critical to communicate to all members of the school system, and it's this: prioritization, not elimination. What that means is we need to constantly remind one another that we are not cutting standards out of the Common Core state standards. We are simply prioritizing to determine which ones are the most complex, which ones are the most comprehensive, which ones deserve the greatest emphasis, both in instruction and assessment, so that we can achieve the promise of the Common Core, which is to move students forward to the next level of learning, prepared to enter that next grade level with those prior standards well in hand.